Greetings everyone and welcome in this webinar. Today we'll be discussing about emergency preparedness and response. My name is Suzan Ayete, the PCB organizer of this webinar, and the guest for today is Mr. Mahesh Vaidya, Director of PCB Partner High Performance Global Consultants. Please write your questions and comments in the question box in the right-hand control panel, and Mr. Vaidya will answer to them accordingly. Moreover, if you want to participate directly with Mr. Vaidya in the discussion, you can also raise your hand and then we will unmute you so you can make your questions directly to him. Please, Mr. Vaidya, you can start the presentation.
Thank you, Suzanne. And everyone welcome to this webinar. Today, I would like to discuss with you an extremely important requirement within the ISO 14001 standard, which is emergency preparedness and response. I'm sure all of you will agree with me that in any organization, whether it is a manufacturing organization or a service providing organization, people are their biggest assets. And what usually happens is, in case of an unseen or unforeseen circumstance, which can affect people, which can affect the environment, organizations usually aren't ready for such a situation. And when organizations are not ready with a plan and a proper response, what results in is loss of life, loss of property, and an enormous and irreparable damage to the environment. And I believe that the 14001 standard has appropriately included this requirement, and it, in fact, is very demanding on the management to ensure that they have a plan for all kinds of eventualities, all kinds of emergencies that can happen, and be prepared to respond and primarily ensure that the damage to the environment is minimized to that extent. So, welcome to this. I'll take you through these requirements. The 14001, clause number 4.4.7, as you may recall, essentially wants an organization's management to identify, prevent, and respond to potential accidents, emergency situations, and to prevent or minimize possible environmental impacts. The idea here is very simple. The standard expects the organization to take a preventative call in terms of identifying what can go wrong, properly document those requirements, have an action plan in place, first to prevent, or if they cannot prevent, to at least minimize potential environmental impacts if an emergency happens. One of the biggest problems that organizations today have is that because the standard wants an emergency preparedness and response plan to be documented, organizations go ahead and document those plans. But there is an enormous amount of difference between having a good documented response plan and actually being able to implement that plan when an emergency happens. Many of the organizations, unfortunately, fail in this. They have an excellent document. There's no doubt about the fact that the document would be very well made and etc. But when it comes to actual implementation of the plan in a real-time emergency, that is where majority of the organizations fail. And that, in fact, results in environmental impacts, which many times are irreversible in nature. So the standard expects that the organization makes a plan and not only prepares and documents a plan, but also reviews it periodically. And the plan is tested by what the standard expects from the organization when it says the procedure shall be tested periodically, is the fact that if I have an emergency preparedness and response plan, which talks about a potential fire emergency, which can happen in my organization or in my manufacturing plant, then the standard expects me to have something which could be called as a mock drill. A mock drill, by the very nature of it, means that I, as an organization, or I, as management, must have a team of people who are competent enough to actually handle that emergency whenever it comes. And I should simulate a situation where I say that there is a fire emergency, and then I must actually test that procedure which I have documented in terms of how well people respond to that in that situation, how well people are able to mitigate the problems and minimize the environmental impact. So the standard is explicit in terms of demanding that these procedures shall be tested. And if you see the word "shall," it obviously means that this is a mandatory requirement of the standard. I would just at this point in time would like to show you a very small film, which is actually a YouTube video, which is of a major fire emergency, or which resulted into a significant environmental impact in sometime in October 2011 in the US. This is a chemical plant in which the fire had started. And if you can see how the fire raged and actually engulfed the entire plant at the end of this film. And if you can see here, gradually it is engulfing the entire manufacturing plant, and also the fire is spreading across. And if you can see here, the black smoke going into the air, because it's a chemical plant, and I'm sure a lot of chemicals, which could, many of them would be hazardous in nature, have actually caught fire. And the fire is so big that the firefighters are not able to reach. And this is causing enormous amount of smoke. See this, it is going into the atmosphere, and this is causing enormous amount of pollution. And usually in such kinds of emergencies, this becomes an irreversible process because the smoke has already gone and it cannot be retrieved back. So possibly in this case, what could have possibly happened is the organization possibly would have had an emergency preparedness and response plan, but when the emergency actually occurred, they just may not have been able to respond properly, and which resulted into this major environmental catastrophe. Going ahead, essentially what everybody needs to ask themselves is whether they have an organization, do they have a mechanism for capturing all possible emergency situations that may arise? Because this is an extremely important thought. If we need to prevent something from happening, or we need to minimize the environmental damage that an emergency situation can cause, it is imperative for an organization's management to sit down with the concerned team and actually capture all possible emergency situations that may arise in the plant or in the manufacturing location. Now, many times this is not done very effectively, and which actually results into downstream problems. The second question which people need to ask themselves is, have you thought of how to avoid these incidents? Because fundamentally, as you know, by definition, an emergency is a situation which can come, or which usually comes unannounced. It takes everybody by surprise. But then there also is a thought process which says that if you're able to capture all possible emergency situations that are likely to occur in the facility, then have you thought of avoiding these anytime? One of the other important things which usually is neglected, or maybe when an actual emergency happens, people panic. So in the end of panic, those who are actually responsible for taking actions, and those who have been trained and made competent to fight a fire or take a corrective action, in fact fail to do so because they are just not able to respond properly, and there's a sense of panic. Another thing which the standard expects an organization to do is whenever an emergency or incident happens. Now, fundamentally, the expectation is that the organization it has a system, must have a system to capture all possible situations and have a plan to prevent or mitigate those. But you never know. And something, for example, if I can give you a relatively recent example of what happened in Japan, Fukushima, and I'm sure all of you will recollect what happened in Fukushima. Because of the tsunami, the impact was on the nuclear plant, and even very advanced technologies and techniques to identify emergencies could actually not capture this potential problem which happened because of the tsunami, and the secondary effect was on the nuclear plant, and the disaster happened. So what the standard expects an organization to do is evaluate whether there are any potential future occurrences. Now, an emergency has already happened. Irrespective of the fact that we never wanted it to happen, it has come, it has happened. So the expectation from the management is whether they have sat down again and evaluated how to avoid this in future and how to avoid the recurrence in future. So that is what the expectation of the standard is. And obviously, the standard then expects that an emergency preparedness and response plan be sort of revisited by the concerned team members. And whatever emergency has happened must now be addressed in the emergency preparedness and response plan, and necessary responsibilities, authorities, and the actual mitigation plans must also be addressed. Going ahead, another key question is, what do emergency procedures have to cover? Because the expectation of the standard is that one should have a procedure for tackling emergencies. But what should a procedure have? Typically, an emergency procedure could have an emergency, for example, if we talk of fire as an emergency. The procedure will essentially need to address issues like evacuation, emergency response, the fire water treatment. If the emergency is spillage, major spillage, then which is what spillage chemicals, so whether it is likely to go into the surface water or any water body near or on the ground, or necessary requirements. Then if flooding is one of the emergencies which has been identified by the organization in the plan, then the plan also needs to address in terms of what an evacuation plan would be. Another I would say a major shortcoming which is usually seen in organizations is the fact that although they may have an emergency procedure, the training and awareness of people within the facility is not up to expectation. Because I'm sure all of you will appreciate and agree that an emergency, when it happens on site, the emergency will not distinguish between whether the person being affected is an employee of the organization, or he or she is a visitor to the organization, or he or she is maybe working on contract. Now the emergency is an emergency which will affect each and every one which is on site. And typically what happens is people who come for a short duration to the plant, for example, a supplier coming to the plant for some work, or a visitor who is coming to the facility, say for a couple of hours, they may not know what kind of emergencies are likely to happen on the plant. And therefore, since they are unaware or they are ignorant and nobody has told them anything about it, they are most likely to be the most affected parties. So the standard also lays a lot of emphasis on ensuring that the organization's management must train people and make them aware of the potential emergency situations that can occur. And if in case an emergency happens, what should be an expected response from anyone who is come for business in that facility or in that plant or in the office. As I discussed it earlier, an incident rehearsal or testing is something that the standard expects. And interesting aspect of this is that if there are certain situations or certain emergencies which one can simulate, for example, one can actually simulate a fire emergency. One can possibly, if I'm talking about in terms of environmental management, I would take an example of, for example, if say the manufacturing site has a wastewater treatment plant on site, and they are treating process effluent on site, and this effluent is after treatment being used within the site for gardening and other purposes. Now, one of the key emergencies which can happen there is the effluent, the wastewater treatment plant can actually break down or become dysfunctional. So if that happens, this could be potentially an emergency which could be impacting the environment, because there's every likelihood that untreated effluent can go into the nearby water bodies or get spilled onto the ground, causing enormous amount of pollution just because the wastewater treatment plant did not function or stopped functioning suddenly. So there are certain situations which an organization can actually do a rehearsal. There can be mock situations, but there could be some situations, for example, natural disasters. Now, something like an earthquake or a lightning strike can possibly not be simulated, unlike fire. So what the standard expects an organization to do is, if that is one of the emergencies which has been identified, say for example earthquake, which is a natural disaster, the standard expects that if you cannot simulate, then at least be prepared. At least have something which is called as a desktop review done. At least call people who would be responsible to act in such emergencies. At least get to know whether they know their responsibilities, whether some people are authorized to take certain decisions when an emergency happens, and at least discuss what could be the evacuation plan in a real-time emergency. So standard expects that we be prepared at any time, every time, for any potential emergency that could happen on site and which could potentially damage the environment. Another important factor that emergency preparedness and response plan must address is the communication with emergency services such as external fire tender services, or the police, or the local hospitals, etc., which could possibly be looped in, so that any emergency of this nature, there can be an external help which could be sought within time. Because I'm sure all of you will agree that the quicker or the less time that people spend in reacting to an emergency, the better it is. Because if the time is lost, then the damage could actually go in multiple proportions. So time is always of essence when we talk of a response to an emergency, and therefore the standard is that when, as an organization, one should be at any point in time be prepared that for any kind of emergency, what communication channels are there, always be there in the emergency response. Obviously, the emergency preventive measures are discussed here. One is something which is called as a risk analysis, and I'm sure all of you know and appreciate the fact that if hazard analysis and risk assessment is done properly, and it is not one person who must do it, but it actually should be a cross-functional approach, and most people who participate in such exercises must be knowledgeable and competent to understand and to contribute to what kind of emergencies can actually happen. So a good, solid risk analysis can possibly help a lot. A routine inspection, for example, if we take some example of say all of us, I'm sure all of you who joined this webinar are aware of the biggest industrial accident or industrial disaster which happened in 1984 in India, in a place called Bhopal, where Union Carbide had a manufacturing plant where they used to manufacture a pesticide called Sevin, for which they were, one of the input materials was called methyl isocyanate, MIC, which is one of the deadliest of chemicals that are used in manufacturing of pesticides. So when this disaster happened, if you go to YouTube, you can find a lot of films which have been made on this disaster. And one of the key analysis of why this problem happened has been given by the experts, who say that a routine inspection of the equipments, a routine inspection of the control equipments, routine inspection of emergency equipments was possibly one of the reasons it was not done properly. And when the disaster actually happened, many of the safety systems did not work, and it resulted into almost in excess of about 3,000 people dying, and several hundred thousands of people permanently affected because of the exposure to methyl isocyanate. So routine inspection is something which can possibly help a lot. Equipment maintenance checks, engineering controls, procedural controls. If I want an emergency to be tackled well, then I'm expected to have excellent procedures, and I'm expected to exercise good controls. Another kind of key point which is addressed here is maybe a substitution with less hazardous materials which are being used, because as we understand and know that in case of something like fire, or in case of something like earthquake, say an earthquake occurs and there's a very large tank farm on the manufacturing facility which has multiple tanks with extremely hazardous chemicals stored in them. So because of the earthquake, maybe some of the tanks rupture or collapse, and which causes enormous amount of hazardous or toxic chemicals to get into the land or get into the nearest water body. So one factor which an organization could possibly look into is whether there can be a substitution of more hazardous materials with relatively less hazardous materials. So if in case of a real-time emergency, there could be, the impact would be there, of course, but that impact could be minimized because there has been a substitution of more hazardous with less hazardous material. So that is something which the standard expects the management to really look at when they do the risk analysis. So this is something which the standard expects in terms of periodic evaluation. And what I will be interested to show it to you is this document, which we have talked about emergency preparedness and response plan, but I have projected here a typical emergency preparedness and response plan. I'm sure you will appreciate and agree that there is no standard format for an emergency preparedness and response plan, and it would depend so much on an organization and the activities that are done there for them to design their emergency preparedness and response plan. But this is, I'll just quickly take you through a typical emergency preparedness and response plan, how it should look like, and what are the typical contents that a plan should have. If you see on your screens, it talks about scope of the plan, types of emergencies which can actually happen. So when you say types of emergencies, it is the management is expected to proactively understand and document these, that this is what we do in the plant, these are the products that we make, these are the raw materials that we store, and this is the kind of topography that we have built our plant on, and therefore these are the emergencies that are likely to happen, or that we are likely to face. Then the third point is the emergency plan. Actually, it's important to also note the emergency organization chart, because as I said, in a real-time emergency, people, if they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, then there is a lot of chaos, and a lot of vital time is lost if people don't know what they're supposed to be doing, what their responsibility is, or what they are authorized to do. Handling emergencies, so in emergency control center, a safe assembly point for people in the facility to assemble there so that they are safe. Evacuation plan, procedure for head count, because I'm sure you'll agree that in a real-time emergency, say in a very large office or a very large manufacturing facility, it is important that when people assemble in a safe assembly point, the procedure for head count must be very clear, so that everybody knows that whoever was inside the plant has actually come out safely and has assembled at the safe assembly point, and there is no one who is actually stuck inside because the head count doesn't match. So procedure for head count, who are supposed to be handling emergencies, the emergency teams, because another important factor which needs to be considered here is that if I am not competent to fight an emergency, say there's an environmental emergency, and I have not been trained as an employee to fight that emergency, I have no business to be a part of the emergency response. I just need to get out of the plant, go and assemble at the safe assembly point, because I have not been trained to fight that emergency. So those people who have been trained and who are competent must go and fight that emergency. One must know their duties and responsibilities, or responsibilities and authorities, and what their role is. So, for example, if there is a competent firefighter, then he or she must know their roles, responsibilities, and without anybody asking them if there's a fire emergency, they must volunteer and go and fight the fire, because they are competent by virtue of their training, qualification, experience, and skills. An annexure to, or the multiple annexures to an emergency response plan. These could be escape routes in case of evacuation, emergency exits, because many times it so happens that in a real-time emergency, people don't know where to exit from. So emergency exits, fire extinguisher layouts, location of first aid boxes, fire hydrants, hose reels, list of important phone numbers. So these are key requirements which are expected to be a part of a typical emergency response plan. This is how the actual emergency plan could look like. The scope, which is applicable to site or an office. What is an emergency? Types of emergencies. So here I have given examples like a major accident, fire, an explosion, a spillage or leakage, which could be a major environmental emergency, a medical emergency such as maybe a stroke or a heart attack or something like that sort. An earthquake, which is a natural disaster, but could result into a major environmental emergency. Breakdown of a wastewater treatment plant. If there is no contingency available, then this could be a major environmental emergency, because, as I said, the untreated effluent could get into water bodies or actually get into bare land, which could cause a lot of pollution. The actual emergency plan, the organization chart, who is the chief controller, who is the site controller, who is the liaison and coordinator. So these names could be very clearly laid down so that people know what their roles and responsibilities are. In case of actual handling of emergencies, then there could be phone numbers which could be given so that anybody who witnesses an emergency or who is expected to raise an alarm, it's very clear to him or her as to which number to contact, what is to be done, whether it is using a whistle or using a siren or using a public address system. How do you actually let everyone know that there is an on-site emergency, and an emergency preparedness response procedure has been put into act. So this is a sequence which is expected to be a part of a typical emergency preparedness and response plan. And usually, if I go back to this example of Fukushima, if some of you who have followed Fukushima disaster will realize that, at least when I looked at the footage of that disaster, I realized that there was no panic whatsoever. I mean, it was an emergency or a disaster of massive proportions, despite which, if you see the footage even now, you will realize that there was no panic. People were not running around. There was no panic at all. And a lot of those people who were given relief measures, for example, food, blankets, etc., you could see people standing in queues for kilometers together, and there was no panic at all. And when I saw that, film on one of the news channels, the commentator made a very, very appropriate comment. He said that you must be wondering why there's no panic, why people are not running around. That is primarily because of the fact that Japan as a country, the entire country lies on a fault line, where earthquakes are a common occurrence. I mean, if they don't have an earthquake maybe every day, a minor earthquake, they would actually be surprised that there's no earthquake today. So he said that the Japanese they have a very fantastic system wherein right from the school, that is when the child starts going to the school, the child is taught about emergency response or emergency preparedness. Because Japan as a country is so prone to natural disasters like earthquake, children are taught how to respond to an emergency right from school days. And emergency mock drills are conducted very religiously in schools, in offices, in business establishments, etc. So people are aware. The basic point, what I'm trying to draw your attention to is everyone is aware as to how to react to an emergency. And the very fact that there is tremendous amount of awareness across the country, there is no panic. And if there is an emergency, people mechanically respond as they have been told, and therefore minimizing loss of human life or minimizing the impact on environment. So it's very interesting to know that when people are aware, then they are in a much better position to respond to an emergency. Then there is expected to be an emergency control center and safe assembly points where people can assemble. And emergency control center is expected to sort of be the hub for all the controls that are required to be done. And competent people need to sit there and ensure that the entire situation is brought under control within a stipulated time. A layout of the plant is something which can find a place in an emergency response plan, because once we have the entire layout very clearly mapped, we can possibly know where to go, where not to go, etc., etc. So this is a very important element or component of an emergency preparedness plan. Emergency escape route plan, because typically when an emergency happens, people who are not supposed to be there are expected to be evacuated immediately, and therefore the escape route plan is something which needs to be very clearly and categorically documented as a part of emergency preparedness and response plan. Procedure for headcount, as I was saying, if there are multiple processes and departments within an organization, this is a sample. So whether everybody from purchase department has actually assembled, or everybody from the machining shop has already assembled, everybody from quality has already assembled. So a headcount procedure can categorically say this, and if there is somebody who is missing, then the emergency evacuation team can actually get into the act and find out as to whether there was somebody who was stuck inside because of certain reason, and then evacuate that person. So emergency teams, then the names of emergency teams such as firefighting team, which process or department do they belong to. First aid team, because in an emergency, then if there is a first aid requirement to be given, then competent and trained first aiders, who are those? The emergency plan is expected to have their names. In case there is a fire emergency, then utilities team, for example, if the power to the plant needs to be shut off because there's an emergency and the utility team needs to come into act, or if there's an emergency related to wastewater treatment, the utility team must ensure that certain requirements are fulfilled, and because they are competent enough to do that. So the names of utility teams, the names of evacuation teams who are competent enough to take people out and who are trained to do so. Then various routes of evacuation must be very clearly laid down in the emergency preparedness and response plan, so that there is no confusion at all, and the people who are expected to evacuate from the plant do so without any undue delay. So that is the crux of the situation, is that there should not be any undue delay, because you will appreciate the fact that if there's a delay of a few seconds or a few minutes, it is a matter of life and death. So the evacuation routes, the duties or roles and responsibilities of people, for example, the chief controller of emergency, what is he expected to be doing, the site controller, the coordinators, and the team members who are expected to coordinate with external helps, for example, doctors, fire tenders, or the State Pollution Control Board, for example. If there's a emergency of this nature, then the regulators need to be called, and somebody needs to call them up and tell them that there's an environmental emergency, so that they can respond appropriately, come on site, and help in terms of fighting that emergency. So these are the essential components what are expected to be a part of emergency preparedness and response plan. We have talked about it, but the training requirements, because this is one of the key concern areas. The plan is there, everything is there, but people are not adequately trained in the emergency preparedness and response plan. So the training requirements for firefighting and rescue teams, first aid teams, utility teams, evacuation teams is expected to be a part of the emergency response plan. List of emergency numbers, list of important telephone numbers, because it may happen that in same case of an environmental emergency, if I need to call an external agency such as a regulator, for example, the pollution control regulator, who is expected to come. But in case, if I don't have the phone number of that regulator, then I am the emergency preparedness and response plan is of no use, because I don't have the number, the required number of the regulator whom I should call, and without any delay, he can possibly come to my site. So important telephone numbers of all the persons, all the agencies, such as police, fire, ambulance, hospitals, etc., are expected to be a part of the emergency preparedness and response plan. So this is typically what an emergency preparedness and response plan can have. It needs to be customized to an organization's requirement. It can possibly be a much bigger plan, or it may be curtailed down to the requirements of an organization. So I thought it was appropriate that I show you a typical plan, because we have talked about an emergency response plan, and this is what it usually looks like. And I'm sure some of you, or most of you, who are part of this webinar and you work in an organization, either a service providing organization or a manufacturing organization, I'm sure you have an emergency response plan which has been prepared, documented by your organization, and majority of the components that I showed you are already featuring in your emergency preparedness and response plan. So this is what I wanted to share with you as far as emergency preparedness and response is concerned. So if you have any specific questions for me, I would be glad to answer those. Hello, Susanna.
Yes, Mr. Mahesh, you should continue with the presentation, and in the end we can answer some questions, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm actually done. I'm through with the presentation, so I'm inviting questions.
Yes, well, in that case, we do have some questions. Well, first of all, thank you for this great presentation. So the first question is, how important is the internal training when it comes to emergency?
I would say it is extremely important, because as I said, and I reiterate, that many of the problems which organizations actually face during an actual emergency is because of either complete lack of training, or the training which was provided was not really effective. So people were not really aware of how to respond to an emergency. So in my view, internal training is something which should not be or cannot be a one-time activity. It needs to be consistent, it needs to be continuous, and particularly for those who are not regular members of the team and who come for some business to an organization for some time, and the training procedure tends to miss those people while they are on site. So I think internal training is extremely important, needs to be not one time, but consistent, and needs to cover each and every person who works in the office, who works on the site.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. It says, what is the suggested periodicity to conduct more mock drills?
Can you repeat that, please, Susanna?
Yes, it says, what is the suggested periodicity, timeline to conduct mock drills?
Okay. If you ask me, if you see certain types of industries, certain categories of industries which are categorized as high hazard, for example, if there's a chemical industry which is using a lot of hazardous chemicals, or an industry where, for example, I gave an example of Union Carbide, so it's a high hazard industry. Many times, regulators in whatever country the industry is or the organization is, the regulators in many countries demand that an emergency mock drill be done at a certain periodicity, for example, once in 6 months, or once a quarter, or at least once a year. So this frequency is either can be stipulated by the regulating agency, or the management of an organization must take a call as to what is the most appropriate frequency. In my view, if there are emergencies identified for an organization, it is ideal that an emergency preparedness and response mock drill be done at least once a quarter, because a lot of new people keep joining an organization. A lot of old hands who were already trained keep leaving organizations. So, and there are a lot of changes which keep happening. So it is imperative and it is important for organizations management to test these procedures through a mock drill, maybe at a periodicity of at least once a quarter, so that everybody is on toes. And if we have a frequency of say once a year becomes too much. People lose its significance, and a lot of changes have happened. So a mock drill done once in a year usually does not serve the purpose. So a quarterly or maybe a 6-monthly frequency is an ideal frequency. And I would also go ahead and say that if an organization is working in multiple shifts, for example, if there's a day shift and if there's a night shift also, it is important for an organization's management to consider this mock drill to be also done during night time, because it is appreciated that during night time there are a less number of people on the site or in the office, and therefore the response could possibly not be as good as it could be in the day shift. And because the response is not good, maybe the environmental damage or loss of life would be much higher during the night shift. So it is recommended that mock drill be done at a periodicity, which is ideally a quarterly or a 6-monthly, and in all working shifts. If it is a night shift, then emergency drill be also done in the night shift, so that the organization's management is very clear in terms of responses at any point or any time of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mahesh. We have one more question. It says, in case of major fire incident in which all emergency response teams are on ground, which of emergency responders should be in the control of the scene?
Please repeat that.
Yes, so once again it says, in case of major fire incident in which all emergency response teams are on the ground, which of emergency responders should be in control of the scene?
In control of the scene?
Yes.
Ideally speaking, if there's a fire emergency, then the chief coordinator must be on the ground leading the team. People who are competent and trained to fight a fire, for example, the trained firemen must lead and must take initiative to fight the fire. Somebody who is a first aider, for example, also needs to join in, because collateral damage of a fire emergency could be that somebody may have burn injuries, somebody may have fallen unconscious. So a first aider also must be on the ground and must participate in the emergency in fighting the emergency. But as I said, the emergency control ECC, that is Emergency Control Center, must have somebody who is not on the actual emergency side, but is coordinating on behalf of the emergency team with an external agency or with whoever is expected to come and fight the fire. So I would say that people who are competent and trained to fight a fire must be present on site, and those who are not competent and trained must not even attempt to fight that emergency, because it usually would be a counterproductive proposition. If I'm not trained and I'm still wanting to be a part of the team, then it could be counterproductive, because I'm not trained and competent to do so. So I would say that those who are trained firefighters, firemen, only will need to go on the ground and try and fight the fire.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mahesh. One last question. How should organizations test their emergency procedures in order to make sure that everything is okay?
An ideal way to validate documented procedure is to actually do a testing. And testing, one of the most acceptable ways to test an emergency preparedness and response procedure is to organize a mock drill. But as I said, that mock drill can possibly not be done in all kinds of emergencies. It can be done in an emergency like fire. For example, if you have a mock fire and then we simulate a fire and then see how people respond to that. But not all emergencies can be simulated. So in my view, an alternative, for example, if there are say 10 members who are expected to be fighting or responding to an emergency, these 10 members must periodically come together, meet, and discuss the other emergencies for which a mock drill cannot be done. So this is typically in an emergency parlance, it is called as a desktop review. So a desktop review is something which is done where one cannot simulate an emergency, but all the 10 members come together and discuss the emergency response thoroughly. And every one of them is very clear as to how to respond to an emergency if a real-time emergency comes. And in spite of the fact that there is no mock drill, everyone is absolutely clear how to respond to an emergency. So I would say that mock drills is the most acceptable way. A simulation, maybe a software simulation, is another way that some organizations tend to validate their procedures. And third is an actual desktop review, where everyone comes together and discusses as to how to respond to this kind of an emergency. And all of them are on one page, I would say, in terms of the response. So these are, to my mind, are the best possible ways in which one can check the procedures and validate the procedures.
Mr. Mahesh, I would like to thank you once again for this presentation. I want to thank all the attendees for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. We hope you enjoy this webinar. We have received all of your questions, and because the time is limited, we will answer to your questions individually by email. Please check PCB's webinar schedule on our website, pcb.com, or our official social media network. Since next week, we are organizing webinars on interesting topics. Next Tuesday, we are hosting a webinar on the topic ISO 40001 Implementation Advantages. Thank you once again.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining.